Hi everyone, my name is Valija and welcome to another episode. It's been a while, we took a bit of a break with the winter break, but now we're back with Tanhaja.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm Tan. I work in the Department of Psychology, and I'm also a PhD researcher at FAO Nürnberg. And I work in the intersection between cognitive psychology and linguistics. And when I have the time, I also do some philosophy stuff, but that's just on the side.
Okay, thank you so much for being on the podcast again. So in short, I'm just going to introduce the episode to you guys a bit so you know what we're going to be talking about. The main focus is languages. I want to try discussing the sort of power dynamics of speaking multiple languages and what influences you to learn certain and different types of languages from different regions, and how they can externally impact the way we see the world around us and also our lives personally and what effects it might have. So, to start it off,
Sure.
how many languages did you grow up speaking?
Um, well, people around me, for the first few years, people around me only spoke Turkish. But after about age 3 or 4, we had to move to Fethiye, where, well, those of you who know Fethiye will know it's a small British colony. It always has been a small little British colony, so to speak. So there were a lot of Anglophone speakers in that part of Turkey. So I then got exposed to some English. There were some German speakers there as well. But, for the majority of my lifetime, I think I would say it's been, at least until, quite recently, it's been, or it was, 75% Turkish to whatever the other number is, English and some other languages.
And at what point, like in your adult life, did you start learning more languages, or how many do you speak now?
Right. So, being a linguist, right, it's a bit of a cliche. And I guess it also depends on how you define speaking. So, if I were to give a strict definition of speaking, as in, yes, I can confidently communicate in this language, I would only say three: Turkish, English, and German.
Okay.
But if we kind of lower the bar to hell and say that, if you just need enough to survive on a daily basis, you don't have to talk to anyone, you just have to survive, I can also include, on top of the three, I can include Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian, obviously because they're just so closely related to German, Spanish and French as well. So another 5 on top of the 3 that I mentioned early on. But yeah.
I would probably go with like the second answer. If someone asked me how many languages I spoke, be like, yeah, like 6. Which is kind of true, again, for like similar reasons, because of like where I'm from, some of the languages are so similar. But yeah, so, okay, I can speak from like the perspective which is like going around hearing languages and just picking up from them because of that and not actively learning. Because even if now I try to like, maybe this is embarrassing, I can't really write well in my native language because I haven't had to in like 5-6 years at this point. So you lose that skill. But like generally when we talk about the effect that like learning or starting to learn multiple languages can have on your brain, your cognition, what do we mean when we say that?
Sure. So cognition. So maybe to kind of clear off, cognition is a term, right? It's very vague, and a lot of people don't really know what it means. But at least when I use the term cognition, at least in this discussion, I just use it to mean brain functions, right?
Okay.
Easy peasy. And learning multiple languages, especially in adulthood, it improves your brain and brain structures because of several reasons, at least on a cognitive brain level, right? It improves your memory skills because now you have to remember the correspondences between a random combination of sounds and an object, right? So why is it that we call this thing a desk in English and masa in Turkish and then der Tisch in German, right? It's arbitrary. It doesn't make any sense, but your brain kind of has to come to terms with the idea that, yes, language is just arbitrary and I have to memorize these things. So it kind of improves your memory skills. The second thing that we know it improves is inhibitory skills, or executive function, so to speak. So for instance, if you speak English and Turkish very well, and you go to your friend group, and you know, let's assume that most of your friend group speaks Turkish. Um, if you speak both languages at a highly proficient level, oftentimes you will experience that um, related words or relevant words from both languages will come to your brain at the same time and will compete with one another. So what your brain does actively in the background is suppress one of the languages so that the other language can kind of come through. And to be able to do this, you have to you have to actively practice this by using your language in different contexts.
Yeah.
So that also improves your executive functioning skills. Let me see, what else? Obviously, right, the more you read and write in those languages, in those foreign languages, so to speak, your awareness will improve, metalinguistic awareness will improve. So the ability to what extent you can reflect on languages in general. You know, when you see a structure, can you really say, there's something wrong with this, and I need to fix it because I know that the rule doesn't apply here. So this is also tied with, up to a certain extent, reasoning skills, or what some people call intelligence. And finally, perhaps this is not so much cognition. I mean, obviously it is related to cognition, but the more languages you learn and the more you can speak them with relative success, the more confident you become, and the easier it becomes for you to learn a third or a fourth language. So basically, if you already speak, your native language pretty well, then you have good confidence in yourself, and you say, you know what, I can do this, and then you learn the second language. And if you also speak that well, and if you're a good communicator, then you're like, well, I already speak two languages anyway, so who cares if I make a couple of mistakes in my third language? So that kind of reduces the cognitive barrier that some people may experience, right? The, I guess, motivation or being afraid to make mistakes. And this is also one of the reasons why I call this the beer phenomenon. Obviously, there's probably a different name for this. People, oftentimes people will say, oh, I can speak X language, I can understand it, but I can't really speak it that well. But then they drink a couple of beer, cups of beer, and then they're like, they start talking like a budgie bird. So this is also one of the reasons why the cognitive barrier, we kind of have to just break it down, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I guess when we take all of those effects together and then we start seeing like how you might understand the world around you in like multiple languages, you see a lot of that with like, now with like social media, parents will like post their kids and like you actively have like, so one parent speaks only one language and the other one only does that in front of the child. So you kind of associate different languages with that. I've seen that happen a bunch of times with like instructors here as well. Do we know like how that's affecting the child or how they're functioning with it?
Right. Yes. So for the first couple of years of a child acquiring two languages at the same time, if the parents decide to do one parent, one language method, then obviously the child is not confused. It just, he or she just thinks that, okay, well, I will turn to my mom and speak in Japanese, and I will turn to my dad and speak in Turkish or whatever that may be. But after a while, once the child realizes that the world is not just consists of the family, but there are multiple social structures, then the child starts to realize, okay, I should be able to use Japanese with not just my mother, but also with my cousins, and sometimes maybe with my even grandma or whatever, right? So it kind of expands. It's a slow process, but it expands quite rapidly, quite extensively. Sorry, not rapidly. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I have heard this from some of my friends. I don't know if there's any research on this. Emotionally speaking, sometimes people will associate certain words, expressions, or even cultural things, so to speak, with their parents because of the linguistic relation, right? So if you only hear, say, Japanese from your mother, then you will ultimately associate all things Japanese with your mother, And every time you see something in Japanese, then your brain may act in ways when it sees your mother, so to speak.
That kind of also reminds me of like how a lot of people, so there's a debate, like half of the people are like English as a language lacks like depth and like the way you might be able to express things in other Asian languages, let's say. But at the same time, like there's others who say like English is one of the most beautiful languages and you can express yourself. You can express yourself in ways that like you can't. But it is true that when it comes to translation, there's a lot that you can't explain in English.
Or vice versa sometimes.
Yeah, that too. I guess I was trying to like just get to the topic of like translation with these languages and going back and forth.
Well, I think my take on this issue is so some people may consider this as a very woke statement, but I don't necessarily consider any language being more creative or less creative or more complex or less complex than the other one. I believe that every language has a way, more or less, has a way of explaining a similar idea, because at the end of the day, the ideas that we are trying to explain are most of the time, are very humane experiences. Now, again, when you take into consideration weird and non-weird perspectives, so weird being Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, right? When you take weird and non-weird perspectives, sure, maybe there are some concepts that are readily available in weird cultures that may not yet exist in non-weird perspectives not because of a linguistic deficiency, not because that they can't have a word for this, but because that advancement, the cultural or technological advancement has not yet reached those non-weird circles. So it's only a matter of time, right? It's because for a language to develop, or for grammar to kind of develop, or even words to develop, all you need is people, ideas, and some time. That's a simple recipe, even simpler than baking a cake. And if you give enough time to people, they will eventually come up with different ideas of referring to that thing, or different words of referring to that idea. One of my favorite examples is, some linguists in the past have argued that, in Turkish we don't have the present perfect tense. I have done XYZ, I have eaten, I have seen blah, 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 this structure that we have in English. While yes, on a formal level, Turkish does not have this, right? Turkish doesn't have a specific suffix or a structure that can realize the same meaning. However, on a meaning level, Turkish does have this. When you say, I have lived in Ankara since 2005, or been living in Ankara since 2005, how you say this in Turkish is, 2005'ten beri Ankara'da yaşıyorum, right? So obviously the your suffix automatically takes on the meaning in combination with den beri, right? So clearly you have different approaches of giving the same meaning in different languages. Now, some languages are more efficient, right? They just use maybe one word or two words, and some languages, let's take the Turkish example, may use more larger structures, and that's okay, right? If the idea is, some languages are more creative or more expressive, then that's just BS. But if you consider the fact that, some languages may be more efficient in telling that idea than some other languages, then sure, right?
Okay. I think that was a really good take. I also don't really understand when people are like bringing down one for the other. I mean, I think it's true. There's some things that you can't translate to, let's say, English, but at the same time, like there's also ways of expressing yourself in English that you might not be able to in a different one.
Exactly.
So that also makes me think of like this other debate, which is like the entire world should just have one common language that everyone can communicate in, so everyone understands each other, and there shouldn't be different languages. What do you think about that?
Right. So I'm assuming that you're referring to the idea of a lingua franca, probably. That would be the technical term anyway.
Okay.
So not far into the past, about 300 years ago, or maybe even 200 years ago, English was not even a thing as a lingua franca. It was French and before that it was Latin, right? So lingua francas can change. And yes, maybe, and I'm speaking purely from an economic or political perspective. I mean, if I were a politician and if I had to meet with the president of Slovakia, and if I don't speak their language and if they don't speak my language, ideally I would like to be able to talk to them in a common language, but that's without the help of a translator. But that's only because I like doing things on my own, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should have a common language that is imposed on everyone. Now, so I guess my take on the issue is a bit mixed. I can't say yes, we should have it, or no, we shouldn't have it. It has advantages and disadvantages on both ends. But one important implication of this, perhaps disadvantage implication of it, at least for Turkey and for Turkish students, is if you go to a university that has English as a medium of instruction and you learn, say, psychology or you learn English literature or linguistics, whatever that may be, and you learn these terms only in English. You don't ever get to read anything in Turkish on the topic, which sometimes there may not be any literature on the topic, but oftentimes there is, even if the literature may be crappy. So what this creates is a, what is that word? A disconnect between Turkish students who are, say, becoming or studying to become cognitive scientists or literature people, but then, they send off a paper in Turkish and they just don't know how to use the terminology correctly.
Yeah.
And that creates a problem. And again, in the same vein, this happened to me as well, and I think you also mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast. Because I haven't had to read anything or write anything in Turkish for the last, good Lord, maybe 8 years or 10 years, my Turkish is abysmally bad. Obviously, I can communicate, right? When I go to the supermarket, when I go to the foreigner's office or whatever, I can communicate with people, but my written English is bad. And that...
Written Turkish.
Sorry, written Turkish is bad, sorry. Thank you. So this, again, I mean, obviously, on the one hand, this is my bad, right? I should be responsible for my own language skills and I should be able to sit down and write and whatever. But also, on the other hand, if you don't get the opportunities and the time, because being a student is a full-time career, especially doing your undergrad, if all you have to do is always in English, then, right? So it's a double-edged sword, and it's very entangled. So it has its drawbacks or disadvantages at the same time, just as it has its advantages too.
Yeah, and that was reminding me of how, like, sometimes when Turkish students ask me, like, how's my Turkish, or speak it, and I'm like, it's pretty bad. Like, I can maybe understand some stuff. It's embarrassing when I try to speak it. And their kind of consolation is, oh, it's okay, we don't really know how to speak Turkish either. Is that a Turkish thing?
I wouldn't say so. I don't think that that's a Turkish thing. I don't think that's generalizable to the entirety of Turkey and the Turkish population within Turkey. Perhaps it is a common, say, phenomenon across campuses where the medium of instruction is English, right? Mm-hmm. Especially for your field, right? I mean, you study English literature, and perhaps, for students in English lit, at Bilkent, that very well may be the case, because if you have to engage in English at all times and you just use Turkish for very, say, mundane reasons, right? Mm-hmm. If it's to buy a piece of bread, if it's to tell someone off, if it's to curse someone off, right? Then obviously your Turkish may decay a little bit, even if you are a native speaker of that language. So I don't, this doesn't really surprise me. And I'm sure as you have seen it, as the audience may have seen it, oftentimes at, Bilkent, Metu, Boğaziçi, blah, 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 these universities, students will have this Tinglish, this mixture of Turkish and English, where, they'll say things like, Hocam, assignment'ı bu akşam submit edebilir miyim? And it's just, good Lord. I mean, I'm not saying that this shouldn't exist, that's beyond the topic. It's just if this is your Turkish at the end of the day, can you really say that you are speaking Turkish on a complex level? Because you probably just use Turkish, at least for some speakers, you just use Turkish on a very mundane level.
Mm-hmm.
And that can result in a decay of your Turkish skills.
I think there's also like a similar kind of phenomenon, I guess, even with us, like Urdu and Hindi are similar, but there's still difference. So with my little cousins, when they're trying to speak, they keep using Hindi words, and the adults have to be like, that's not right. And even in English, like we kind of like mix like Urdu and English sometimes, to the point where like you're not really making the distinction that you're speaking two different languages.
Mm-hmm.
And I sometimes accidentally end up saying something in Urdu to my Turkish friends, and then I'm like, wait, that's not right. So I think it's really, yeah, merging languages is interesting. But I was also thinking, there's also another side of this, not another side of this debate, but we can say
one
that,
of the
I guess.
sides of this debate.
It's when it comes to like traveling and knowing the native languages. So half the people, obviously, if you love to travel, there's so many countries in the world with lots of different like national or
minority
languages.
Mm-hmm.
You can't learn how to speak each of those proficiently before you're about to go and know exactly what you're gonna ask. So on one hand, people are like, it's okay, you don't need to know. People are kind, they help, and that is true in some
cases. Up to a certain extent,
yeah.
Except for Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. But anyway.
And then you also have the other side where like some of like the native people might get like really, really angry at you because you come to their country without knowing how to speak something. And it's also like creating like this sort of disdain for foreigners, but also sometimes like specific like color of foreigners, you know?
Exactly. Well, it also, results in, now I know that this is not the correct term for this, but the best word I can come up with right now is ghettos, right?
Mm-hmm.
Linguistic ghettos. Because if you have this disdain, if you have this hatred as the host country to a people of, a group of people, whatever they may be, then obviously those people are going to withdraw themselves, and they may not be willing to engage with your language because of the attitudes that the host country may pose to them. This happens in Turkey, this happens in Germany, in Portugal, Spain, basically across the world this happens. And for example, you can think of Ankara as a very simple example, and if you go to certain parts of Ankara, there will be neighborhoods with majority Arabic speakers, for example, people coming from Syria, for instance. And I have seen it myself, I have experienced it myself. In those communities, people may not be likely to learn Turkish, or may not be likely to know Turkish because of the attitudes or the disconnect between their community and the external, the community within which they're living. The same thing happens in Germany. You can go to Berlin, and I have met multiple Turkish-German Almanca people who don't know a single word of German, but who have been living in Germany for the last 10, 15, 20 years. Well, in cities like, Munich, Berlin, Stuttgart, or Düsseldorf, this is very easy because then, everybody kind of speaks Turkish anyway, and everything is simply in Turkish. So there is also that incentive as well. But in smaller counties, for example, there are still some people who kind of refuse to learn German, or who just don't learn German on a proficient level. And obviously then, this may, up to a certain extent, lead to some hatred, some racism, different forms of xenophobia, as we've seen with the election results a couple of weeks back in Germany. So, yeah, it's a complicated matter, and I don't really know how to go about it, really.
Yeah. I was also, like, for example, for me, anywhere I go, I will have the foreigner label on me, but at the same time, like, I'm kind of like trying to trace like where's racism even coming from, and sometimes you can like just say like it's like the color of your skin, but then all of that is also like, you have colonial powers in the way like stuff started in the past. So like if we look at like Korea and China and like Japan and like the attitudes that they might have towards each other, But I kind of was thinking of this one example, like for example, if you go to Korea and you're an overseas Korean, so you don't necessarily, maybe you don't look the right kind of Korean, maybe you're speaking in English. There have been instances where older native people will start yelling at these foreigners because they're not Korean.
Mm-hmm.
And then they turn around and they yell back and they're like, I am Korean, and then they stop.
Yeah.
But it's the very like just aggressive, angry, violent way of like dealing with people around you.
Yeah, I mean, this has happened to me in Germany multiple times. Turkish people there would call me the F slur and things like that in Turkish, and then I would turn around and be like, "Excuse me, I speak Turkish," responding back in Turkish.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to legitimize this. I don't want to, find an excuse for this because there is no excuse.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is that it happens anywhere and everywhere to anyone and everyone. And I think at one point we just kind of have to develop a thick skin. Obviously, this is not the solution. The solution should be that we need to be able to fight with this, against this, stand up against this. But I think part of the issue comes from the fact that we just have nationalism to its core, right?
Yeah.
And nationalism is the reason why we have, up to a certain extent, you could claim racism. Whether it's ethno-linguistic or not ethno-linguistic, that's a different debate. But I think nationalism is definitely one of the main reasons behind this, I would say.
Okay. Because, so kind of thinking of English after that, first there's also an attitude of like the English speaking world, which is that speak English. It's better. You can talk to everyone. What's the problem? Why speak multiple languages? I'm too good to know multiple languages. I speak English, hence I don't need to learn anything else. And then you also have the attitudes of post-colonial countries themselves. I guess specifically if you think about the ones that had been under the British Raj, it would be like, oh, you're speaking English, but you're speaking English with an accent. Why do you have an accent? Sound more American. Sound more like this. Which is also very kind of confusing because...
It's iffy, it's disgusting.
Yeah, because you're not sitting in a Western country.
And you don't have to speak American English.
Exactly.
Because, I'm sorry if you were going to ask a question, if I derailed your question.
No.
But,
continue, please.
This is, I can't remember the exact quote. This is a book in sociolinguistics. God forbid, I can't remember the name of the author, but it's something like, a language is a language as long as there's a state that's protecting it. Something like, or a military that's protecting it, something like that. If you look at the Balkan region, or if you look at Sweden, Norway, Denmark, they're all basically the same language, goddammit. Or even, this is perhaps a bit of a stretch, but, Azerbaijani Turkish versus Turkey Turkish, yes, they are different, obviously, but up to a certain extent, there is a high degree of mutual intelligence and intelligibility. But a more a better example is you look at Serbian, Croatian, and what's the other one? Bosniak or Bosnian. They're practically the same language.
Okay.
Grammatically, lexically, they are the same language. Yes, they kind of sound like different dialects of the same language, but technically they are the same language. And so, don't worry, I'll connect this to the previous topic.
It's fine.
But it's just because there are political entities that are protecting these languages and calling them, yes, this is Hrvatski, this is Serbian, this is Bosniak, you can't call this anything else.
Yeah.
So kind of connecting this back to world Englishes, I think that's the term. So for example, recently in linguistic research, there's been a shift in kind of studying and recognizing world Englishes, different types of Englishes. For example, there is Singaporean English. There is, I don't know, I think it's called Indian English. There is, there's a couple more that I can't remember right now. Mostly concentrated within the southeast part of the world. But basically, once we start analyzing them, documenting them, we legitimize their existence, and we say, well, this is a variety in and of itself, right? Because, for example, Singaporean English, I think we covered this in our previous class. Its syntax is different than standard English. Its lexicon is different, so it kind of warrants to have its own um, variety, or to be called its own variety. And the same thing applies to Indian English. And big companies like Apple or Samsung, when you go to your settings on your phone and you go to Siri, once you start seeing different dialects for English, you see US, UK, and then you see Indian, you see Singaporean or Irish, whatever, then it becomes more and more legitimized, and you kind of validate its existence. And my take on monolingual Anglophone speakers is that people who refuse to learn different languages, it's dumb, because you're basically betraying your brain, because your brain has so much potential to learn different languages, and you're just lazy. And B, this, up to a certain extent, at least within the U.S. context, has something to do with the racist past. So early on in the 1910s, 1920s, or just in the beginning of the 1900s, the U.S. was getting a lot of migration from Italy, as well as from Mexico or South America, to speak broadly. And obviously these people look slightly different than people who were already in the U.S. And so the problem was that these people would come in and they would form their own communities, and they would struggle to learn English, or they would speak some English, but it would be quote unquote broken. So the kids, their children, when they would go to school, the indoctrination was that, from the teachers and from the scientists at the time, the indoctrination was that no, at home you cannot speak your native language, you can't speak your home language, you have to speak English, because if you speak two languages at the same time, this will hinder your cognitive development, this will hinder your English development, blah 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 blah, things like that. So it also has something to do with that, right? It's, if you grow up with this type of idea, it kind of gets handed down like across generations, just like the idea that drinking milk is good for your health. It's because of the milk lobby, the farmers lobby back in the 50s and 60s. It has no real evidence showing that. I mean, obviously it has some benefits, but what I'm trying to say is, if you grow up with certain ideas, and if you don't really see anything else contradicting that idea, then you will kind of hand that down. Just like when we were growing up, right? Pluto was at one point a planet, then it wasn't a planet, then it was a dwarf something, and now it is a planet, right? So it's like, just to give an analogy, right? So I hope that kind of makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. It was also like kind of reminded me, I saw this thing online which was saying like the difference between like the Ottoman Empire ruled for a long time over a lot of places, but you don't but you don't have like Turkish spread out over like that, like, and the difference kind of was they didn't make people speak Turkish. No, I don't know much about the Ottoman Empire.
I don't either, sadly. So ask your question and I'll try my best.
Okay. And you compare that to like English, and it was kind of like the I guess part of the goal was to like erase cultures in a way, and erase languages in a way that everyone speaks English and becomes like half of something but not entirely. That's all post-colonial theories about too, of course.
Exactly.
But yeah, that I don't know. I just thought it was interesting, and I mentioned it.
It is. So a disclaimer, I don't really know history that well. I'm not a historian. I didn't really do a whole lot of reading on the Ottoman history, nor did I pay much attention in history classes in high school when the topic was the Ottoman Empire, because what the F. So based on my understanding so far, and my the conversations that I've had with other people in the field of history, I think the Ottoman Empire worked slightly differently than, say, the British Empire when it comes to kind of erasing culture. I think the Ottoman Empire did it more so on a religion basis rather than a linguistic basis. Because, for example, the town that I'm from, Fethiye still had a large Greek-speaking community. I mean, there was Kayaka. Kayaka was basically an entire Greek village. So people spoke their language, people could publish in their language, and I'm pretty certain that was the case for other minority populations in the Ottoman Empire as well. Now, obviously, this may not have been the case for the entirety of the Ottoman Empire, but maybe for a small section, but still. But how the Ottoman Empire tried to erase their culture, again, based on my understanding and my personal experiences in Fethiye, for example, is they would take over a church and they would cover everything related to the church, like all the paintings, all the murals, all the religious symbols, paint over them, cover them, and turn it into a mosque, right? And if you cut this off, this connection to their culture, because, right, at least within the Ottoman Empire, your biggest cultural connection to your ethnicity is your religion. If you are Muslim, you are automatically a Turk, at least, in quotation marks. And if you are non-Muslim, then you are automatically a non-Turk. So it worked in a system of binaries. At least my understanding is that.
Okay.
And I guess that's the reason why within the Ottoman Empire, it was up to a certain extent different than the British Empire when it comes to linguistic erasure. I am sure there must be some evidence, some documentation of within the Ottoman history where they also erased some linguistic connections as well, but I don't know because I've never done any reading on this topic.
Okay, that's fair, but that was still informative enough. Well, I mean, I knew nothing about it. Okay, that is like the bigger chunk of like discussion points that I wanted to cover. The last bit was sort of a bit about if you want to say something on this. So understanding kind of like culture and cultural practices. So when like what you see, what maybe you hear from like a native or like a smaller like ethnic language versus like trying to understand it or explain it in like, let's say, English. Is there research, do you know like the different like nuances between understanding culture through like different languages?
Let me see if I understand the question correctly first. So you're asking if there is any research investigating how people understand the same culture from different languages?
Yeah, and maybe if that creates differences, or not even like if there's research, like, do you have thoughts about it?
Right.
Or
Well, okay, so I don't know any research exactly on culture. Now, on a linguistic level, there is some research at the intersection of language and thought, or conceptualizations, I guess you would say. And this kind of goes back to the idea of the Piraha language, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, right? All of these things that started the entire discussion. And one of the simple examples for this is English speakers, Spanish speakers, and Turkish speakers, for instance, differ from one another when they conceptualize time.
Okay.
So in Turkish, if you want to say, pause, like mola, right, a pause, and you want to add a modifier in front of it, then you say küçük mola.
Okay.
Right? And in Spanish, you do the same as well. I don't know, I think it's un poquito something. But in English, you don't say a little pause, but you're more likely to say a short pause or a short break. Now, what this shows us, and there are more languages that do either or, both of them, or one of the options. What this shows us is some language communities are more likely to conceptualize time in volume, right? Big or small is volume, metric cube.
Yeah.
Whereas some languages like English may be more likely to measure time or conceptualize time in a linear format, right? Because if you say short or long, it's on a line. Like you measure a line, basically. So having said this, again, I don't know any research on this. This is just my speculation. People reading about one culture from their language, in their native language. So let's assume that I'm an English native speaker and I'm reading about a culture in English in somewhere in Southeast Asia, so to speak. Obviously, my linguistic filters are at work, and it may affect up to a certain extent what I make of their culture, how I judge their culture, how, the certain biases that I may have. But this may not be the case for some people as well, because maybe they're culturally aware and that they know they shouldn't be bad people, nasty people. And maybe the same thing applies vice versa to the other culture on the other hand, right? So it's very speculative, but I would probably say there may be some effect of it, but it's probably not a simple thing of, just because it's a different language, then automatically they have biases or not. Probably there are multiple factors at work, like how sexist a person is, how xenophobic a person is, where they were born, how they were raised, what level of education they received, how often they read, how much do they get in touch with other communities, people from other cultures, and so on and so forth. So
I think the thing that you were just talking about, like time, like understanding the concept of time through language, is also very, very interesting. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
So being a pop culture linguist, and this is only for 1 second, and I detest this film with all my heart and every single atom in my body. The movie Arrival, you may have seen it, you may know it, some of the people in the audience may know it. I think it came out in 2015 or 2016. It's basically this alien species or whatever that comes to the Earth, and there's this linguist that the CIA or the U.S. government decides to hire, and basically she has to work out their language and talk to them. And the movie is all about how. So on the one hand, theoretically, it's a very nice thing. I don't like the movie because of different reasons, not because of linguistic reasons. The movie basically says, well, human languages are written linearly, and that's why we kind of understand time in a linear manner. This part is not very theoretically accurate, but whatever. And their language, the language of the alien species, they kind of speak in this circular manner, or they write their language in a circular manner or whatever, and that's why they can kind of jump in time. It's not linear. They can go to this point, this point, blah, 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 blah. So from that context, if anyone is interested and has not seen the movie, I would recommend seeing the movie, although it's 2 hours of pure boredom because of the acting. I think the acting sucks.
Okay.
But regardless of my judgment, the issue of time, the understanding of time is not just time, obviously. For instance, for a while, European linguists would study Piraha, a language spoken in the Amazon region in South America, and they would make comparisons of Piraha to European languages and say, well, they don't have a past particle, they don't have a future particle, and then they would make the assumption that Piraha people probably don't have a way of referring to the future or referring to the past. Obviously, 40 years later, with more research, we realized that was a false assumption, that was a racist assumption, based on a small number of Indo-European languages, right? What they then realized was that not every language has to have the same particle to be able to refer to the past or the future, and this again applies to the present perfect discussion that we had at the beginning between English and Turkish. Is the same idea, and so my idea is that I think time is so universal that we all experience, and when I say we, I mean typically developing people who are not on any maybe spectrums or who don't have any neuro degenerative diseases or whatever. I mean quote unquote healthy neurotypical people. Yeah. Time is so universal that I think all languages must have some ways of explaining similar time-related ideas in their languages. Now, the way they conceptualize them may be slightly different, maybe because of cultural reasons or other reasons that I don't know. And I think it's very interesting, but this gets into the field of metaphors, similes, and so on and so forth. So it's not really my field, so I don't really know a whole lot on that. But you could also argue the same thing for color perception. For instance, you might remember this from some of your CCI classes. In ancient Greek people would call the color of the ocean or of the sea like a red wine. It's clearly not red, right? I mean, at least from our perspective, it's blue, it's not red. So, over time, these terms may change, or even within some languages, you might have different color terms. For instance, Russian and Turkish have this, but English doesn't. To say dark blue in Turkish, you have a specific word, lacivert. And you have a similar word to this in Russian, but I don't know the word. But in English, you don't have this specific lexical unit. If you want to talk about different shades of blue, then you have to say dark or light blue. You have to specifically specify. Another color that I really like in Turkish that doesn't exist in English as well, I think, is eflatun. It's a shade of purple, but it's not really purple. It's like an eggplant purple, slightly with a tint of brown. It's right.
Oh, okay.
So, and when people do this color perception task with speakers from, say, Indo-European languages or from Turkey, weird-ish perspectives versus non-weird perspectives. When people go, researchers take participants from, say, different tribes in Africa, maybe. What they find is they are able to, these people are able to differentiate between the colors. They may not have a word to describe that color, but cognitively speaking, they can still differentiate the colors. So this kind of, again, comes back to the idea that not having a word or an expression for an idea does not necessarily mean that you are not able to understand that, or you're not able to distinguish that idea from something else. And this is where racism again comes into the play. Some people would like to play up on this idea and say, well, if you don't have this word and that word in your language, then obviously you're dumb and you deserve to die, and this. I think this is partially where this ethno-linguistic tension or this colonialist idea comes into play. I think that's how they play on this. Okay. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it was lovely. Thank you. The "you should die if you don't have this" also reminded me of like the sort of debate between like metric systems and how people have adopted that. Yeah. And me and a friend were just talking about it yesterday, and I said like, yeah, like we say feet as well. It's not just the Americans. And she's like, but the Americans get dragged for it and you guys aren't. And I'm like, can you imagine dragging a third world country for adopting a different metric
Exactly,
system?
right. It's funny, but these are things that we need to become more aware of, actively aware of, and also kind of discuss on a more, I guess, both policy level but also on a political level, so that we all become more aware of these little nuances, because I think these little nuances are where the devil lies, and where a lot of racist people may lurk in, I guess. Yeah. If that makes sense. I don't know.
Okay. Well, that was lovely. Thank you so much for...
Thank you for having me.
entertaining all of my questions. Well, this is like a topic that is of great interest to me, especially, so I was really, really excited to do this, so thank you for sitting down.
Yeah, of course.